Technology that we have and different methods and tactics that it provides to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And podcasting is really a very valid and legitimate method in utilizing the technologies that are at our disposal. However, podcasting does have its limitations, as you well know. Unlike webcasting, you can't really interact in real time. So what we've done, we've made arrangements whereby you can ask questions or make comments and send them to us via email. That's right, all you've got to do is go ahead and email us at billw@cgi.org, and hopefully this is going to enhance the educational value of the subject that we're covering as we go through the topics in a more specific way, being directed by your questions and your comments. So let's go ahead now, prepare to go back into the book that we're studying, and we'll look forward to your comments and questions. Just email us. Remember, email us at billw@cgi.org.
All righty. Well, again, welcome to the Bible study on Daniel. Good to see everybody here. And hopefully today we will begin to embark on chapter 1. We'll see how far we get through it. The more I get into this, the more broader the topic and the subject becomes with all the history and all of the things that seem to be so pertinent about this particular book. But we'll go ahead and begin to attempt to try to explore chapter 1 today. So before we get started, I'd like to ask Mr. Dave Rusinko to give the opening prayer. You all just bow your heads, that's fine.
Heavenly Father, we come before you today after our weekly convocation to meet together. We are going to study the Bible in Daniel, and we ask that you come down with us and open our minds to the learning that we're about to have today. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. So last week we went ahead and covered quite a bit of material for orientation, kind of developing some context on where we sit in the timeline of history. And many of you, through the course of that, came to understand that Daniel is actually mentioned in the New Testament too. I'm not going to go back there. I'll just reference Matthew 24:15, where Daniel there is mentioned, and Jesus essentially quoting Matthew 26, verse 64 again, confirming another quotation reference to Daniel. And actually, I don't know how many of you are aware of this or not, but for many years there was a large debate with regards to the authorship and the timing of when the book was written, as far as Daniel is concerned. And the argument is that many scholars thought that the book was written after Jesus Christ, post-Christ, AD, as they would say. But the fact of it was, uniquely enough, the Dead Sea Scrolls proved otherwise. And an interesting archaeological find was fragments of the book of Daniel were part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that put a lot of the naysayers or gainsayers to quietness, and consequently they don't debate the authorship that much, or at least the timing of the authorship that much anymore. Now, we also came up on, and I left many of us hanging, I think, on the fact that Daniel brings us in the context of history up to the point, and this is an important watershed moment, it's an important demarcation in the sand, it's something that is very critical to recognize as to why God started prophecies of the end times at this point in history. I mean, we're thousands of years removed from the Garden of Eden. We're thousands of years removed from the Noachian deluge. Why would he start now, of all things? Why not start right from the start at Babylon and Nimrod, this side of the flood, and the Tower of Babel and all of that? I've often thought, because he does start with Babylon, but not the Babylon of Nimrod. And that used to always confuse me back in the early years. I used to always think, is it Babylon of Nimrod or Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar? And which was which and how that all happened, and why did he choose Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar rather than Babylon of Nimrod? And those were questions I had when I was first learning about what we're talking about today. But it's important we recognize this demarcation, this line in the sand, because it is significant from the standpoint of this very important key to prophecy, or key to understanding prophecy, or key in having an outlook regarding prophecy. And that is, of course, what I'm saying and what I'm talking about is having the perspective God has in looking at the world from the paradigm of Israel. Since Abraham was given back in Genesis 12, that original promise whereby he would become a great nation, and through his lineage, through his seed, through his family line, all the families of mankind would be blessed through that Abraham line, through Isaac and Jacob, and of course the 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. The issue, as far as God is concerned, from that point on has been an outlook, a paradigm, a view of looking at the world from where's Israel? Where's Israel? What's Israel doing? Because Israel was his first love, and Israel was his favored nation in that regard. That's why we have a most recent Armor of God program out right now. As a matter of fact, this week it uniquely came out and was timed very well. Is God a racist? Because he's favoring allegedly a nation. So that's a good question, very provocative, and I think especially in the day and age we're living in with all that's in the air, and certainly seeing what we're seeing played out in some of the cities that here in the U.S. and Canada, it's a very, I think, poignant question to have. But the demarcation is, this is the first time now Babylon comes in and beats up Judah. Remember the divided kingdom, Israel and Judah. Remember, God looks at the world through the paradigm of Israel. The 10 tribes of Israel taken away captive by the Assyrians 120, 130 years before where we're at in Daniel. Daniel's 120, 130 years removed from the Assyrian conquering of the 10 tribes. And the Babylonians since then have conquered the Assyrians. And the Babylonians now are invading Judah, the only tribe left, only nation standing, representing any kind of residual of Israel. And now, with Nebuchadnezzar coming into Judah, capital city Jerusalem, remember the 10 tribes, their capital city was Samaria. They're gone. The fact of it is, Jerusalem now, under attack, Nebuchadnezzar comes in, first invasion of three, 605 BC. 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar rolls in and essentially beats up Jehoiakim, who was the king of Judah at that time. Jehoiakim, who was the son of Josiah. Josiah, a very good king, wonderful king, good guy. How Jehoiakim turned out to be the bad apple he was is certainly, quite a mystery, because Josiah was such a good guy. But in all due respect to this, the demarcation is, this is the first time now, the first time in over 500 years, planet Earth has no nation of Israel. There is no definitive group of people defined as Israel. The 10 tribes are in captivity, already migrating westward, up in the Caspian Sea area, and Black Sea area. They're already in the Caucasus Mountains, moving westward, Parthian Empire and so forth. And the Jews are left there in Palestine, now under siege by the Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar moves in, of course, and begins his invasion there of the area, and consequently hauls off a lot of Jews, including Daniel. Daniel went with the first invasion in 605. So this leaves no nation of Israel on planet Earth. And for the next 70 years, prophecy, 70 years, the Jews remain under the heel and in captivity to the Babylonians. From this point, it's almost like God drops a curtain, clears the board, and behind accoutrements of the stage are being reset. Everything's being reset for the coming Messiah, the first coming. The Maccabean Revolution, Alexander the Great, the four-headed leopard, as you'll see in the vision of Daniel. This is all coming down the line. This book is so exciting. It gets so exciting. And one thing really exciting about it is it proves God exists. I talked about the solar eclipse proving God exists. You're going to see things that were written, I'm telling you, hundreds of years, literally hundreds of years before they happened. And history validates what the Bible says was going to happen hundreds of years before it happened. As I said, Nostradamus has nothing over the Bible. Why people don't get excited about the Bible over Nostradamus, I don't understand. But the Bible is far more exciting because it's actually validated, substantiated, supported, and anchored, reinforced by history, archaeology. It's amazing. It's an amazing story, amazing proof, and certainly something I think all of us should take some time to note because it does validate the authenticity and, of course, the realness of the Bible. Now, Daniel is called the Old Testament apocalypse, the Old Testament apocalypse, and rightly so because it parallels Revelation. We're going to be seeing that as we go forward into the book of Daniel and how that does indeed connect up with Revelation in many ways. And again, here once more, you have a guy 600 years later from Daniel, a guy named John, the apostle, exiled on the Isle of Patmos over there off the Mediterranean, the coasts of Greece and so forth. And he, 600 years later, from when Daniel received some first impressions of visions of prophecy and end times, validates with the same dream, the same animals. And you can read about that as you compare, as a little preview of Revelation chapter 13 with Daniel chapter 7. And you'll see how the animals correspond, connect up, tether to each other, thereby substantiating the fact of what you're dealing with in John, Revelation, because what John describes in symbolism and in figures of speech is described in detail of who and what the roots are of those animals in Daniel 7. So when you connect them together, you get sequence and identity. This is good stuff. It's exciting stuff. It really is. And I don't know how anybody can't get excited about the fact of when you start seeing these things and understanding that the Bible, God's Word, is talking to you. It's talking to you. You don't need to make anything up. You really don't need to make anything up. There's so much on the internet today. So many of these guys with wild ideas, and women with wild ideas about Revelation, going here and there and Daniel and this and that and trying to, force this and say this means that and interpret this particular symbol or that particular object with this, that, and the other thing. And you don't have to do that. You really don't have to do that. And unfortunately, they get themselves all twisted up in a lot of contradiction, and of course, unfortunately, sometimes it bleeds over into making the whole Christian community look silly and foolish by virtue of sometimes date setting and so on. I mean, how many have you heard, I'm sure you've heard, as I've heard, how many thought that this solar eclipse was going to be a big deal. And some still think, they're still hanging in the shadows about the fact that, well, that was just the beginning, and now the rapture is going to occur on September 23rd. The rapture is happening on September 23rd, And I'm taking notes because I'm looking at who all these people are, and I'm going to email them and write them and say, now, you owe me an apology. I'll probably get a kickback saying, no, you've been left behind, buddy. I'm gone. That would get my attention. But at any rate, it is very interesting, of course. And Daniel is what is really valuable from the book of Daniel is he's very pragmatic about his descriptions, and he's very detailed. So as we get into these things, we're going to see profiles of the beast. We're going to see descriptions of the government of the beast. We're going to see the outgrowths of how this beast begins to form and come to fruition in the end times to take the dominant role on the world and become the globalist government that it is destined to become. Because the globalists, as I've said, and I'll say it again, do indeed win. the nationalists or the populists, regardless of what you might be thinking today with Brexit and with the advent of a president called Donald J. Trump being president, the populists and the nationalists, regardless of what those movements represent, do lose in the end, according to your Bible, and a socialistic system does emerge onto the world scene, having 10 kings who pool their assets together with a tyrant who has his co-partner in crime called the false prophet, and the two of them run roughshod with the assets of those 10 kings and wreak all kinds of havoc on the world, even implementing and deploying a mark on the citizens of the world so that if you don't have it, you cannot integrate into the system. You cannot become a citizen. You can't work. You can't really hold down a job or make a living in doing what you've got to do unless you have that mark. And God is very adamant about that mark. He says, do not receive it. Come out of her, my people. You know, these are all things that certainly we'll be getting into as we proceed in discussing this book of Daniel and some of the meanings that it provides us with and certainly insights that it provides us with. So one last thing, just as far as orientation is concerned, Daniel can be divided up into two equal parts, chapters 1 through 6, chapters 7 through 12. Keep in mind also that the book was written in two different languages, Aramaic and Hebrew. Aramaic and Hebrew. The first half was roughly Aramaic, the second half is more Hebrew, and rightly so, as most scholars will tell you, the first half of the book is primarily a lot of drama and associated social descriptions and stories about what Daniel and his three buddies went through regarding their integration and moving up to Babylon into the king's court and so on. There is a vision, chapter 2 we'll get into, that Daniel does receive, and there are some other things that prophetically do occur, but nothing like what the latter half of the book is packed with. It's almost reverse. You've got more visions and prophecies in the latter part and less about what Daniel's going through socially in the system. But point being, of course, that it's important that we keep that in mind. So Daniel chapter 1, let's go over there to Daniel and start off with chapter 1. And here we see what I have already kind of touched on a little bit, and we're going to take some time and go through some of this history because I want to bring you up to speed on what is happening here and how Daniel plays into all of this. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. Now, this is about 605 BC, 605 BC, where he besieges Jerusalem under the rulership of Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim is essentially the son of Josiah. And I want to go back over here, you can keep your finger in Daniel, we'll be going back to that, but I want to go back to 2 Kings for a moment. 2 Kings, and in chapter 23, 2 Kings chapter 23. Keep in mind, 2 Kings chapter 24 and 25 is a description of the downfall of Judah and all of the things that were associated with it. And 2 Kings chapters 15 through 18 describe the downfall of the 10 tribes. So 2 Kings 15 and 18, the downfall of the 10 tribes, which came before the downfall of Judah, which is described in 2 Kings 24 and 25, chapters 24 and 25. And all three sieges are described in 2 Kings, chapters 24 and 25, as all four sieges are described in 2 Kings 15 through 18 with the description of the lost 10 tribes. A lot of people think that, it was just one hit, that was it, and the Tiglath-Pileser, who was the king of Assyria, just beat the daylights out of the 10 tribes with one invasion. No. 4 invasions over 65 years is what it took. And that was a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy, where he said to the king of Judah, who at the time was afraid that he was going to be beat up by his cohorts, the Israelites in the north. The Jews were afraid that the Israelites were going to beat him up. Isaiah said, no, don't worry about don't worry about that, because in 65 years, Israel, meaning the 10 tribes, would not even be a nation. And sure enough, over 4 sieges, the Assyrians did indeed take the northern 10 tribes out. But here in chapter 23 of 2 Kings, back to what we were talking about, we read here in verse 25 that Josiah, and this is the connection of Josiah. You can read about that in chapter 23, verse 1. You can start reading there about Josiah and how he got rid of all the Sodomites. And in verse 7, he found the book of the law, and he started keeping the Passover, verses 22. And he was just a real good guy. And verse 25, it says, "And like unto him was there no king before him, that turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to the law of Moses. Neither after him arose there any like him. However, even though Josiah was such a nice guy, God was not pleased with Judah. He still had some things against Judah. Notwithstanding," verse 26, 2 Kings 23, "notwithstanding, the Lord turned not from his fierceness of his great wrath." He was still mad. He was still angry. God remained angry at Judah. And he says here, "Wherewith his anger was kindled against Judah because of all the provocations that Manasseh, King Manasseh, had provoked," that was before Josiah, "provoked him withal. And the Lord said, I will remove Judah also out of my sight, as I have removed Israel, and will cast off this city Jerusalem, which I have chosen, and the house of which I said, my name shall be there." So God's got kind of a conundrum here. I've often used the term that, God oftentimes paints himself into a corner, because he says he's going to do certain things. And you think to yourself, man, how's he going to get out of this one? Because he's painting himself into a corner again. Because here he says, right here, I'm going to take out Judah, I'm going to take out Jerusalem, and then he says, "And the house of which I said, my name shall be there." But you don't have no house, God. You just took your house out. I mean, how does that happen? God, you took your house out, so how can you still be in a house? Your house is gone. But you know as well as I do that the Jews came back 70 years later, reestablished under Cyrus their nation, and set the stage for the first coming of the Word incarnate, of which a new temple was built, all the accoutrements, all the props were put in place, and we have a whole new continuation of the ongoing saga, the ongoing story of how this being, God the Father, is in essence weaving this narrative that is actually proposing and presenting a plan called salvation, by which he's buying his creation back to himself through the sacrifice of Christ. It's an amazing story. It's just amazing. So at any rate, we see here Josiah was a great king, and Jehoiakim was the son of Josiah, and he became the king of Israel, or Judah, I should say, of Judah. And over here in 2 Kings chapter 23 still, dropping down to verse 34, we see this. Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in the room of Josiah his father, and turned his name to Jehoiakim. So Eliakim's name was changed to Jehoiakim, and now Jehoiakim is indeed Eliakim, which is the son of Judah, or son of Josiah. I'm sorry, son of Josiah. So all you got to remember is Jehoiakim. That's all you got to remember. The connection, though, is he is the son of Josiah, good king. But Jehoiakim is not a good guy. It goes on here, and he says in verse 35, "And Jehoiakim gave the silver and the gold to Pharaoh, but he taxed the land to give the money according to the commandment of Pharaoh. He exacted the silver and the gold of the people of the land, of every one according to his taxation, to give it unto Pharaoh Necho." Now, keep in mind, there are some players going on over there in the Middle East at this time of what we're talking about in Daniel 1, which is picked up here in 2 Kings 23, 24, and 25. 2 Kings 23, 24, and 25 are running in parallel with Daniel 1, okay? There's also parallels in Chronicles. I'm not going to go there for right now. But my point is, there are 4 books. Here, this is something important to take note of. 4 books, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, devoted to outlining the division of Israel, the divided kingdom. It is a chronicling of Israel's divide under two leaders, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, commenced, with Samaria in the north, the 10 tribes, capital city, Jerusalem to the south, Judah, capital city. Rehoboam king in the beginning, first one, in the south, Jerusalem. Jeroboam in the north, 10 tribes, Samaria, capital city. 4 books divided into this, describing the division of the nation of Israel, and the vast majority of the Christian community completely ignore it. Completely ignore it. They think that Jews are Israel, that all of Israel is just Jews. No. Are Jews Israelites? Yes. Are they all Israelites? No. Are all Ohioans U.S. citizens? Forget the illegals. Yes. But are all U.S. citizens Ohioans? No. So you get the drift. You get the drift. And yet the vast, I'm telling you, millions, not just hundreds of thousands, millions of Christians today, and you probably could write off 95%, if not 98.9% of all the evangelicals and 98.9% of all the Protestants, completely ignore the fact that Israel was at war with the Jews. Huh? How could Israel be at war with the Jews? Well, if you understand the key of the divided kingdom, you understand the northern 10 tribes called Israel were at war with Judah, the Jews. But God stopped the war, but they did war back and forth and killed each other, often to the tune of sometimes tens of thousands of brothers and sisters that they had. But my point again is, it's important for us to recognize there is a divided kingdom that was. And this, where we're picking up in the book of Daniel chapter 1, is the erasing of any nation called Israel off the planet for the first time since the days of Saul. This is important. This is important. And so we have this situation in 1 Kings where now we pick it up, and verse 36, Jehoiakim was 25 years old, that's all he was, when he began to reign. And he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Zebudah, and she was the daughter of Pedaiah of Ramah. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. Now, I want you to take note of something. Pharaoh Necho was the guy that made Jehoiakim the king of Jerusalem. He was the one, Necho they call him, Necho II actually, of Egypt. And what I was going to say before I got distracted a little bit is there was a lot of activity going on here with Egypt, Syria, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Jews. There were a lot, 5, 6, even more players than that probably, that I just don't have listed, but those come off the top of my head, that were all in the mix, fighting amongst one another, shifting and jousting for rulership of the area. And Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, was really on the roll. They were beating up the Assyrians. The Assyrians were the you could say the Nazis of the neighborhood. They were the bad boys, but they were finally losing ground over the 100 years after they had conquered the 10 tribes, and consequently now were being displaced by the Babylonians, of which the Babylonians successfully beat up the Egyptians. And it was on Nebuchadnezzar's return back that he decided to stop off and beat the daylights out of the Jews. And in 605, we pick up verse 1 here. It was in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, that Nebuchadnezzar rolled into Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar. That was where Babylon was located primarily, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Now, these were not all the vessels. You're going to find here as we go through later on in 2 Kings that ultimately it took until the 3rd siege that finally Nebuchadnezzar completely took everything out of that temple and took it back to Babylon. But he started right here in 605 BC. And the king spoke to Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well-favored, skillful in wisdom, cunning in knowledge, understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning of the tongue of the Chaldeans. And so here you have the fact that these were children. The Hebrew word here used is that essentially they were young men. And it comes from two Hebrew words, one meaning could be construed like in verse 3 there. The Hebrew word there could be construed a son or a grandson. The word children in verse 4 is a different Hebrew word. It can be construed as a lad or a young child or a young man. And most scholars will tell you that Daniel was probably somewhere in the range of 15 to 17 years old. He was a teenager. And most scholars will tell you that he lived about 90 years over the timeline span of the book of Daniel, and by virtue of some of the things that are described in the historical records of events, you can kind of gauge, but they really don't know how long he lived because there's really no record of when he died. But the fact of it is there's a lot of conjecture that he lived about 90 years and died around in the year 530 or so BC, 530, of which then, putting the prophets in their sequence, the book of Haggai picks up right afterwards because Haggai comes on the scene at about 521, about 9 years after many scholars will say Daniel died. So Daniel now is captured, and he's with his three buddies, and he's got the four of them are essentially, for all intents and purposes, being taken up into the king's court. Now, interestingly enough, in chapter 24, I want to go back to 2 Kings chapter 24. 2 Kings in chapter 24, and just pick up this historical parallel with Daniel 1, just to kind of keep you in sequence here. Chapter 24, 2 Kings, in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. So Jehoiakim gets beat up by Nebuchadnezzar, even though Necho II of Egypt made him king. Jehoiakim, becomes a satellite nation, what you could say, what do you call them when one nation pays another nation booty? The word slips me here, but they become a satellite nation. They become subject unto Babylon, and they pay taxes as Jehoiakim was paying taxes to the Egyptians. Now he's shifted because the Egyptians got beat up by Nebuchadnezzar also, and now Nebuchadnezzar is dominating Jehoiakim, and he's paying to him. He says here, then he turned and rebelled against him, and the Lord sent against him bands of Chaldees and bands of Syrians and bands of Moabites, and here's the other guys, bands of the children of Ammon, and sent them against Judah to destroy it according to the word of the Lord which he spoke by his prophets. This is fulfilled prophecy. This is another proof. The Bible is right. This happened before it happened. It was stated that it was going to happen, and now it's happening. Now it's happening. These are fulfilled prophecies. Surely at the commandment, verse 3, 2 Kings 24, 2 Kings 24, 3, surely at the commandment of the Lord came this upon Judah to remove them out of his sight. Why? For the sins of Manasseh. Manasseh was a terrible king. For the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he did, and also for the innocent blood that he, Manasseh, shed. For he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. So, verse 6, Jehoiakim sleeps with his fathers, and Jehoiachin, or Jehoiakin, if you want to call it. One was Kim, the other was Kin. Kim and Kin, okay? And consequently, Kin is the son of Kim. And he comes and reigns in his stead. The king of Egypt comes not again any more out of the land, for the king of Babylon had taken from the river of Egypt unto the river of Euphrates all that pertained to the king of Egypt. So the king of Egypt now is out of play. He's gone. You get into this history. Follow this history. Babylon is now moving in position to become the dominant power of the neighborhood. The Assyrians are gone. The Assyrians are gone also. So, Jehoiakim, 18 years old he was when he began to reign Jerusalem. He lasts 3 months. His mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. Verse 9. He did that which was evil. Another bad guy. Another bad guy. Jehoiakim, another bad guy. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father did. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, comes against Jerusalem. The city was besieged. Again, second siege. This is 597 BC. Second siege, 597 BC. So that puts us about 8 years, 8 years from the time of the 605, the initial invasion. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, comes against the city, and his servants did besiege it. Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon. He and his mother, his servants, the princes, the officers. The king of Babylon took him in the 8th year of his reign. So if you take 8 from 605, you get 597. You with me? So this was actually 8 years later. We went in 10 verses, we covered 8 years of history. You see how that works? It's important you catch these things because that's how prophecy works. Sometimes 10 verses will take you thousands of years. This just took us 8 years. 8 years. From verse 1 to verse 10, 8 years passed. So we see here that Jehoiakim was taken in his 8th year of reign. And let's see here, verse 12. His mother and servants, officers, and the king of Babylon took him in the 8th year of his reign. Verse 13, and he carried out thence all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the kings of the house, and cut pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon king of Israel had made in the temple of the Lord, as the Lord had said. And he carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes, and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained, save the poorest sort of the people of the land. He carried away Jehoiakim to Babylon, the king's mother, the king's wives, officers, the mighty men of the land, those carried into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. Verse 16, all men of mighty, 7,000 craftsmen, smiths, 1,000 in all that were strong and apt for war. Even them the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon. 17, and the king of Babylon made Mattaniah, his father's brother's stead, and changed his name to Zedekiah. Last king, Zedekiah, was 21 when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. Mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah, and he did that which was evil. You'd think these guys would learn. You'd think these guys would learn. What is wrong? Hello. Dumb as a box of rocks, as they would say. You know, one time after another. And he remains evil. Where's the guys like Josiah? Where are they? They no longer exist. Why? Corruption. Corruption. It just keeps compounding, 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 and gets worse and worse and worse. That's why you always see in a basket of apples, if one apple is rotten, all the rest of the apples get rotten. It's easier to go south than it is to go north. Did you ever put a good apple in a rotten basket of apples? Did the rotten apples get good? Doesn't work that way. It deteriorates. So at any rate, we go on here, verse 20, for verse 20, 2 Kings 24, verse 20. For through the anger of the Lord it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah until he cast them out from his presence, that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So Zedekiah is going to rebel. He's in place now. The second invasion occurred, 597. Keep this in mind. Ezekiel went with the second invasion. He was taken to the river Kibar, not up to the king's court. Ezekiel was contemporary with Daniel, as was Jeremiah. Jeremiah was never taken. Jeremiah was left in Jerusalem. He was left in Israel, Judah. As a matter of fact, they put him up they put him into dung up to his neck. They had to actually rescue him out of that. But the point of it was, 3 guys in 3 different locations, all being used of God. God's got 3 parallel missions going on. Don't ever let anybody tell you God works through only one man at a time. Not true. Not true at all. God works through multiple characters at one time. He worked through 12 apostles all at the same time. We don't ever think in those terms. They weren't all answering to Peter. They weren't all answering to James. Thomas, he went up to, the good case can be made, to India. And some of them, like Paul and so forth, went all the way to England, the UK. I mean, you can make the case that others went into North Africa. So, point being, God is not able to be put in a box. He works through many administrations in parallel. And in this case, it was no different. He was working through Daniel, Ezekiel, and of course, Jeremiah. Chapter 25, 2 Kings, I just want to finish this history lesson out here a little bit. Verse 1, it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, Zedekiah's, so now we're 9 years down, roughly, and it says, in the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, all the hosts against Jerusalem, so here he comes again, and pitched against it. They built forts against it round about. The city was besieged unto the 11th year of King Zedekiah. Okay, so if you take 11 years out of from 597, you're in 586. 587, 586. And this is when this was all going on. This is the 3rd siege. The 3rd siege. This is the 3rd siege. 11 years after the 2nd siege. 8 years after the 1st siege. Daniel, keep in mind, he's been in captivity for 20 years already. He was taken way back in 605. We're in 586. What is that? Is that 20 years? Almost. Yeah, 24 years. So Daniel's been up in Babylon, working up there in the king's court for 24 years, him and his buddies. And if he was 15, or let's just say 16, let's say he was 16 years old for a happy medium between 15 and 17. 24 years, he's what now? 40, right? 16 and 24 is 40. He's 40 years old. He's 40 years old when Judah is invaded the 3rd time. So I want you to get these parallels. I want you to get some context here, some idea of what we're talking about so that you begin to understand the time passing, the timeline that all this is built on, so that you get some kind of sequence of practicality and, of course, time that has passed. And in the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine prevailed in the city. This is verse 4 now of chapter 25, 2 Kings. The city was broken up. All men of war fled by night. And the gate between the 2 walls, which was by the king's garden, now the Chaldees were against the city round about. The king went away toward the plain. The army of the Chaldees pursued the king. He overtook him in the plains. You know the rest of the story. They slew his sons, Zedekiah, right before his eyes, and then poked Zedekiah's eyes out, bound him in fetters and brass, and carried him to Babylon. I mean, the Babylonians were brutal people. Brutal people. Poked his eyes out, killed his sons in front of him before they poked his eyes out, and then poked his eyes out, and then took him up in chains and fetters. So the Babylonians now have complete control of Judah. There is no nation of Judah anymore. For the first time in over 500 years, there is no Israel on planet Earth. And Daniel is up in the king's court, and he is being basically positioned to be taught the Chaldean language as well as integrated or assimilated into Chaldean culture. And this was a common, what you could say, method, a common tactic Babylonians used as they attempted to try to integrate the countries they conquered, the empires that they would conquer, because they wanted to take some of their good good captives, those that were intelligent and knew the cultures of the other empires they conquered, to be those liaisons so they could integrate those empires and cultures into their own culture. So this was a natural and certainly a very logical and reasonable tactic that the winner of battle would do upon those that lost. Verse 5 now. The king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So right here we see established that Daniel is being put into a 3-year program. He's being put into a 3-year program with all food and drink covered. It's all covered. Lodging is all covered, food, drink is all covered, and it's a 3-year program that he's being put into right here, verse 5. Now, among these, verse 6, were his buddies, were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the princes of the eunuchs gave Chaldean names. They didn't like those names, those Hebrew names. Didn't want those Hebrew names. So they gave them names. For he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah Shadrach, and to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. Daniel purposed his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. First obstacle. Here they are in captivity, and they're being told to eat what the king eats and drink what the king drinks. And apparently there was something that was incompatible to their Hebrew background. Some of the scholars will tell you that it may have been pork, it may have been pork fat, it may have been ham, sliced pork, and the wine. Of course, we know you can drink wine as long as you don't get drunk, but unfortunately in this case, it may have been wine that was used in religious services, so that it may not have been necessarily even unclean meat, technically speaking, but ceremonially unclean. Ceremonially unclean, because it was used in the ceremony of worshiping pagan gods. And so Daniel, 15, 16, 17 years old, takes a stand. I'm not eating that stuff. I'm not drinking that stuff. Whoa. Now, I don't know what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did, whether they said, you're putting us here in straits, or whether or not they said, yeah, But we do know this. They ultimately did say, yeah, we're with him. We're making a stand. And we understand that because it flips later on. You're going to see this in the book. Both groups, the 3 buddies and Daniel, all get a chance to stand on their own when Daniel gets thrown in the lion's den. Remember that? And the 3 buddies get thrown in the furnace. Daniel's not there. A lot of people think Daniel got thrown in the furnace. No, he didn't. No, he didn't. Daniel did not get thrown in the furnace. Those 3 boys were thrown in the furnace, and they had to stand on their own too. But we're getting ahead of ourselves there a little bit. But in this case, it says here, Daniel purposed himself. So many scholars will tell you, and commentaries will tell you, what that means is he determined in his mind he was not going to compromise this. This was not in any way, shape, or form doable. I'm making a stand. This is pretty tough stuff for a young guy to do this. So he says, therefore, he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, this is interesting, because this tells us a lot without telling us, because the next verse indicates the results of this request, the result of the request that Daniel makes. Verse 9, God brought Daniel into favor, and tender love means not in any way, shape, or form erotic or anything like that. It means compassion, pity, or mercy, meaning this guy looked at Daniel, and Daniel had such a personality that it won his heart, and he viewed Daniel with compassion. He viewed Daniel with mercy. He viewed Daniel with empathy and pity, because he knew Daniel was a captive. He knew Daniel was, from Judah, and consequently under his care. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your meat and drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Which indicates there were others besides Daniel and his three buddies. There were other children, other teens in and amongst these guys that apparently, because there is no record that they took a stand, may have compromised their roles and positions. We don't know that for sure. But we do know this, that this particular eunuch was redressing, or what you could say, kicking back on Daniel in saying, look, do you know what you're saying? The king has given me orders to give you his food and drink. You don't have a choice in this. You got to eat this stuff and you got to drink this stuff. And Daniel, he's saying, and he says, because I'm worried that if you don't, you're not going to look good at in the end of it, at the end of the day. So he says, then shall you make me endanger my head? In other words, the king will cut my head off, because I'm responsible for you. You got to eat this stuff. And if you don't, you're getting me in trouble. You're under my care. You're in my charge. Look what Daniel does. This is good. Daniel says to Melzer, that's not Jim Melzer, that's Melzer. He says to Melzer, who's in charge of him, because remember, Ashpenaz in verse 3, he was the master of the eunuchs, and apparently he delegated it to Melzer, who the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Notice they're not using the Chaldean names. Isn't that interesting? Here the Word of God is using their Hebrew names. Prove your servant. So Daniel now says, look, I got a deal. I'm going to make a deal with you. He says, I beseech you, 10 days. Give me 10 days. Let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Pulse was nothing more than a Hebrew term that indicated vegetables, primarily vegetables, not really any meat, primarily vegetables. And consequently, Daniel's making this deal. He's saying, look, Melzer, look, give me 10 days, and you'll see what I'm talking about. You have nothing to worry about. We will look good. We will be okay. You won't lose your head on this. Don't fear. Things will work out. We'll be able to handle this. So he says here, then look on our countenance, verse 13, this is Daniel talking still. Look on our countenance, be looked upon before you, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. You see, the other ones did eat. So Daniel's saying, you compare us with them, because apparently that sort of our group is compromising. They're going to eat the meat that you want them to eat. They're going to drink the drink you want them to drink. But I'm telling you, Melzer, I'm telling you, you compare us in 10 days, you compare us with them, and I guarantee we'll look better than them. That's what he's saying. So right here we see that the other group apparently did compromise, because Daniel's appealing to use them as a comparison to them 10 days later. He says, and you see the deal with your servants. And so, verse 14, he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days in this particular case. And so, here we see Daniel and the eunuch who was in charge of them cut this deal, and for all intents and purposes, he concedes, verse 14, he consented to the request. Excuse me. Verse 15 now. At the end of 10 days, their countenances, meaning all three boys and Daniel, all four of them, their countenances, verse 14 here, appeared fairer, fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Therefore, thus Melzer took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and he gave them the vegetables. He said, well, I'm out of the woods. My head won't roll. You guys are looking pretty good. I don't know if he said, hey, you guys, you other guys, eat these vegetables. But I don't know if he did or not. But the point of it is, certainly he was relieved, Melzer was, in seeing 10 days later that Daniel was indeed healthier looking, along with his three buddies, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So here we see some values that are really interesting that I think, and this is really a story for teenagers. It's unfortunate there's no teenagers here in the room, but it's really a story at how teens took a stand here. Because don't think that his three buddies weren't teenagers too. All of them that were teens. They were all in their 15, 16, 17, maybe 18 years old the most, but most commentaries will tell you that they don't think they were much older than 17 years old. Most of them think they were like 15 years old. So bottom line is, I mean, this took a lot of courage, a lot of guts, a lot of resolve, a lot of just plain flat out tenacity to stand up to the situation that they found themselves in, because they were incarcerated. They were prisoners of war. I mean, they could have lost everything that they were being offered in a New York minute by virtue of this, what could be alleged to be viewed as a rebellion and or an ungratefulness, or don't you appreciate what I'm offering here? You're the prisoner, I'm the captor here, you know. You got to listen to me, I'm not listening to you. But nothing like that occurred here. And it shows us, obviously, that Daniel was very courteous, he was very polite, he was very affirmative, but yet wasn't offensive. He won the favor of Melzer. He won his favor. Melzer was so moved in talking to Daniel that he looked upon him with compassion. Tender love, it says there, as it described. He looked on him with empathy and pity as to what he was requesting and how he was putting it across. God touched the heart of Melzer, and that therefore gave certainly Daniel the ability to go ahead and get what he was looking for in terms of relief from being required to eat what he viewed as being unclean or ceremonially unclean. So continuing on here, in verse 17, we move on, and it says here in verse 17, excuse me, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now that was miraculous. That was a gift that God gave to Daniel. That isn't a learned technique. That's not a learned gift. That's a gift of God giving to him for special reasons and for special purposes. Because remember, God's in charge here, and God is steering this whole thing. And what God is setting up, remember, the curtain came down, the stage is being reset. God is going to lay down some prophecies here going on into the end time from this point on, and he needs to use certain conduits to get that material downline for the purpose of notifying end time generations. He's setting this up. He's very methodic. God is a construction guy. He's an engineer. He takes things step by step, utilizing the realm of humanity to work his plan and to certainly in some cases get what he wants to get done. So, verse 18 now, at the end of the days, the king says he should bring them in. Dum, dum, dum. 3 years are up. Daniel now, maybe 20. Maybe he's 18. But he's somewhere in his late teens, maybe he's early 20s. 3 years later, now at the end of the days, verse 18, Daniel 1, the king has said, you should bring them in. Then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. The king communed with them, talked to them, sat them down, discussed with them, probably evaluated their ability to speak Chaldean. Because remember, they learned the language. So I'm sure he put them through some hoops and vetted them a bit to see just how well informed and how capable they were. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and of course Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. So that meant that essentially they passed with flying colors, and all 4 of them were approved without a doubt. No questions asked. Nebuchadnezzar was impressed. In all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better. And that's just hyperbolous. I mean, there's no way to quantify that really in many respects. Many will say that that's just kind of hyperbole to use the term that these guys were really on their game. better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. And that takes us, of course, to the end of Daniel's life. That's just given us a kind of a thumbnail sketch that Daniel continued on even to the threshold of the return of Judah back to Israel in that regard. But here we see then Daniel now is in. The stage is being set, and consequently from here on out we begin now to see what this is going to do for Daniel and his three buddies, and how they're going to be used of God in the ensuing chapters here, and what's going to result from that. But before we end this, I just want to recap here that God, it's obvious, was going to use Daniel to his advantage. Daniel became, and here's, I think, about 5 different things we could learn from Daniel in just chapter 1. 1, he was a role model. He may have even been the role model to his 3 buddies in the beginning. They may have had their doubts, but when they saw Daniel stand up, courage oftentimes is, and enthusiasm is oftentimes contagious. And, if you can do it, I can do it. That's why oftentimes, when you're weightlifting, you weightlift in pairs. When you play team sports, you encourage each other. Good run, good hit, good catch. You do those kinds of things because you're on the team. And consequently, it's certainly not inappropriate to think that they did encourage one another as they began to take their stand. Daniel was also earmarked to interpret dreams and signs, number 3, 2 and 3, to interpret dreams, and number 3, to interpret signs. And that was a God-given gift, along with the 4th one, which was he was also a seer of visions, which obviously makes him a prophet. He was also, get this, he was also an advisor to 4 different kings. He rose up in the ranks of the political structure of 4 kings under 2 different empires, Babylon and the Medes and the Persians. Medes and the Persians being one. So he basically interacted with 4 different kings spread out over 4 different kings spread out over 2 different kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar was king 1, Belshazzar 2, which was the son of Nebuchadnezzar, I believe, I remember correctly. Darius the Mede was 3, and of course, Cyrus. Can you imagine Daniel? I've often thought about this. There he is, an old man. He doesn't know when the 70 years started, but he does know in reading the book of Jeremiah, the scrolls, it wasn't a book, it was scrolls of Jeremiah, because you're going to see Daniel read Jeremiah. He even says, I read Jeremiah, and when I read Jeremiah, I was told by Jeremiah the prophet that we were only going to be in captivity 70 years. And that later on, Cyrus, he found out Cyrus because he obviously had the scrolls of Isaiah. Remember, Isaiah prophesied to the 10 tribes. Isaiah was long gone dead. Jeremiah was still alive. But Isaiah was long gone dead, over 100 years, and he's reading Isaiah knowing full well Cyrus, because Isaiah named Cyrus. He named him, that he would be the liberator of the Jews when the Jews would go into captivity in Babylon. He named it. You talk about prophecies, and that was like what, 150 years before it happened? No, more than that. It was, what was it? Yeah, about 120 years, 150 years or so. The point of it is, though, these are fulfilled prophecies that afford us to understand that the Bible is definitely the Word of God, and in this particular case illustrates how Daniel rose through the ranks of the political system of his time. He served as, listen to this, he served as the governor of a Babylonian province. He was 3rd ruler to the throne of Babylon at one time. In other words, like in our case today, here in the U.S., we have the President, the Vice President, Speaker of the House. If President and Vice President both are unable to be the President, the Speaker of the House becomes President. That's where Daniel was. Daniel was 3rd in line to become the king of Babylon. Whoa! And then he was also, get this, one of 3 presidents for Darius the Mede. And these 3 guys basically oversaw regions of the Medes and the Persians. So if anybody tells you that you shouldn't be talking politics when you talk about the Bible, tell them they don't know what they're talking about. This book is loaded with politics. It's loaded with politics. And if we're not plugged into politics, speaking out on the issues of the day, then shame on us. Daniel didn't get to where he was by just talking about the Torah, the writings, and the prophets. Remember, there was no New Testament. He got there by being political, by being devoted to the politics of the day, and knowing how to steer the influences that he was incumbent to provide to those kings he served as an official advisor in the capacity that he served when asked. That's politics. Big time. Very big time politics. And Daniel was able, through the course of his lifetime, achieve those roles. He was elevated among the Gentiles by God's doing, and he remained a conduit for God. He communicated his end-time prophecies and visions and announcements for the purposes to mankind. The story now in Daniel 2 really begins to unfold with the first vision of Daniel, which is the statue, the head of gold and silver and so forth. So this is now going to begin to take off. God is going to begin to commence now in laying out the beginning narrative of the end times and what we in the end time generations have to look forward to as we view end time prophecy through the paradigm, remember, of Israel. Of Israel. And remember at this time, too, there are still promises laying out here that were given to Abraham that have not been achieved. One of them, actually both of them at this point, both of them have not been achieved. One, Israel has yet to become a great nation and company of nations. Up to this point, we're in the 7th century, in the 6th century, and Israel still has not become a company and great nation. And the seed by which all mankind would be blessed through has not come yet. Not at this point. Has not come yet. Both of these promises to Abraham have yet to be fulfilled and remain still at this point unfulfilled. Now, some people will argue the fact that Israel of old, which this marks the end of, did become that great nation and company of nations. Show me the chapter and verse. It's not there. Not there. Especially under the nameplates of Manasseh, the tribe of Manasseh, and Ephraim, sons of one tribe, father Joseph, who got a double portion, Manasseh and Ephraim. Manasseh and Ephraim in the 10-tribe nation was not a great nation and company of nations. They were just two tribes in and amongst the tribes of Israel up there, representing the tribe of Joseph. And they went into captivity. Oh, they had good times. You know, maybe some people had 2 chariots and they had a summer house with some ivory couches and stuff in their summer houses along the Mediterranean and all that. But by comparison, by Monday night quarterbacking from our perspective in the 21st century, that was nothing compared to some of the things that are experienced here in the West under the American flag, the Canadian flag, New Zealand, and all the other countries that are certainly able to be tracked down to the nation of Israel and the 10 tribes. But that's another story. But as we go through this, keep this paradigm in mind, because it all comes together as we go down through these prophecies and visions and begin to overlap into Revelation and come forward. So it's really going to be interesting. I think it gives us a lot of consideration to consider. Chapter 2, we're going to get into then the first dream of Nebuchadnezzar and the interpretation that Daniel is requested to put on it after the others fail. So with that, that'll be the end of chapter 1.